In late July, a Hong Kong-registered trading company most people had never heard of signed a contract worth somewhere between $60 and $70 million. On paper, it looked like an unremarkable commercial transaction, the kind of mid-size industrial deal that gets logged in a shipping manifest and forgotten. According to Reuters, citing 3 separate sources familiar with the arrangement, that contract covered as many as 400 Chinese-made shoulder-fired air defense missiles, bound for a country that had spent the previous 5 months getting its air defenses systematically dismantled by American and Israeli airstrikes. The planned route was almost absurdly specific. Fly the equipment out of Urumqi in China's far western Xinjiang region, then move it through Pakistan and finally into Iran, with the exact method of that final leg deliberately left unclear. Within hours of the report going public, Beijing called it completely baseless. Islamabad called it concocted and false, and somewhere in Washington, officials were left trying to reconcile that denial with something the President of the United States had said to reporters only days earlier, that China's own leader had personally assured him this exact thing would not happen. If you want to understand how a $60 million missile deal turned into one of the most consequential open questions of this entire war, stick around, because this channel has been tracking China's role in this conflict since before most outlets treated it as a story worth covering. Subscribing genuinely helps more people see this kind of reporting before it becomes the headline everyone else is racing to explain. To understand why this specific shipment matters as much as it does, you have to go back to a very particular moment just days before the Reuters report broke, because the timing here is not incidental. President of America had reiterated publicly that Chinese President Xi Jinping had given him a direct personal assurance that Chinese firms would not arm Tehran. It was framed as a diplomatic win, one piece of a broader effort to keep this conflict from pulling in a second major world power. China, for its part, had spent the previous months positioning itself as a concerned bystander, a close political ally of Iran that had repeatedly condemned the American and Israeli strikes since they began at the end of February, while publicly claiming to limit its actual involvement to behind-the-scenes diplomacy. That was the official story. Reuters and multiple other outlets had a different one, and it had been building for months before this particular deal ever became public. Back in April, only days after a brief 2-week ceasefire had taken hold, CNN reported that American intelligence sources believed China was already preparing to move man-portable air defense systems into Iran through third countries, a claim China's foreign ministry denied at the time in almost identical language to what it would use again in July. When President of America was informed of that April report, he told reporters directly that China would have, in his words, big problems if it followed through, a warning that apparently did little to change the underlying trajectory of what was actually happening. Around the same period, CBS News reported that the Defense Intelligence Agency believed China was also considering supplying Iran with X-band radar systems, a category of equipment considerably more sophisticated than shoulder-fired missiles, used for high-resolution tracking of incoming aircraft and missiles. And in a separate investigation published in April, the Financial Times, citing leaked Iranian military documents, reported that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Force had secretly acquired a high-resolution Chinese reconnaissance satellite as far back as late 2024. Months before this war even began, suggesting the intelligence relationship between Beijing and Tehran predates the current conflict by a significant margin, rather than being a wartime improvisation. By early May, the picture had expanded again. A defense-focused newsletter citing reporting from The Telegraph described 5 separate shipments of sodium perchlorate, a key chemical precursor used in solid propellant rocket fuel, arriving in Iran from China aboard vessels owned by the Islamic Republic of Iran Shipping Line Group, a shipping company the United States had already sanctioned back in 2021. According to maritime tracking data, 4 of those vessels were located near the port of Chabahar and a 5th near Bandar Abbas, both significant Iranian port cities. China had reportedly supplied sodium perchlorate to Iran's ballistic missile program before, meaning this wasn't a new relationship being tested for the first time, but a familiar one being reactivated at a moment when American and Israeli strikes were specifically targeting Iran's missile fuel and solid propellant motor production sites. In other words, while the world's attention was fixed on footage of bunker-buster strikes and naval blockades, a separate and considerably quieter supply chain was apparently working to replace exactly what those strikes were trying to destroy. That's the backdrop the July MANPADS report landed against. According to Reuters' sourcing, Iran and a company called Zhongqing Baoshang International Investment, based in Hong Kong and acting as an intermediary for the actual Chinese manufacturer, had signed a deal for between 300 and 400 QW-12 and FN-16 shoulder-fired air defense systems, together worth $60 to $70 million, with the first shipment expected within weeks of the report. A second Middle Eastern security source, speaking separately, indicated Iran had also been seeking QW-18 systems and wasn't certain whether that particular piece of the arrangement had been finalized. Two Western intelligence sources and a senior Iranian official told Reuters that Tehran had been actively exploring overland routes specifically to move this kind of equipment more discreetly, reducing the risk that the shipment would be intercepted or disrupted along the way, a level of operational planning that suggests both sides understood exactly how sensitive this transaction was. Reuters also noted, almost as an aside that turned out to matter considerably, that Iran was separately reported to be close to a deal with China for anti-ship cruise missiles, though it remained unclear at the time whether that agreement had actually been completed. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what is and isn't confirmed, because a story with this many moving parts is exactly the kind where it's easy to blur reported claims into established fact. China's foreign ministry has repeatedly and explicitly denied every element of this reporting, calling the allegations completely baseless and groundless, and insisting Beijing has consistently worked to promote peace and end the conflict rather than fuel it. When directly asked about the deal at a press briefing, a Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson said he wasn't familiar with the situation, a carefully non-committal answer that neither confirmed nor denied anything specific. Pakistan's military public relations wing was more forceful, explicitly calling any suggestion of its involvement in transporting these weapons completely fabricated and false. None of these denials have been independently disproven, and Reuters' own sourcing includes the caveat that exact quantities, delivery schedules, and other implementation details could still change, even though the underlying agreement had reportedly already been signed. What we're left with is a well-sourced set of reports from a major international news agency, built on multiple independent sources, sitting directly opposite a set of flat, categorical denials from every government named in them. That gap between what's reported and what's officially acknowledged is itself part of the story, and it's worth remembering as we go deeper into why this particular shipment, if it's proceeding as described, would matter so much. To understand why 400 shoulder-fired missiles could genuinely reshape part of this war, you need to understand what a QW-12 or FN-16 actually is, and more importantly, what it replaces. These are man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS for short, shoulder-launched infrared-guided missiles designed to be carried and fired by a single soldier or a small team, with an effective engagement range up to roughly 6 kilometers and an altitude ceiling under 4 kilometers. That's a modest range compared to the large, radar-guided surface-to-air missile batteries that traditionally form the backbone of a country's air defense network, the kind of static, fixed-position systems that Iran had relied on for years, and that American and Israeli strikes spent the opening months of this war specifically hunting down and destroying. And that's precisely the point. A fixed-site air defense battery is a known, trackable target, something that shows up on satellite imagery in the same location day after day until it's found and eliminated. A dispersed network of MANPADS teams is the opposite. Mobile, easy to conceal, cheap enough to distribute in large numbers, and using infrared rather than active radar to track a target, meaning the weapon doesn't emit a detectable signal that would give away its position the way a traditional radar-guided system does. The math on this deal illustrates the strategy clearly. At an average cost of somewhere between $150,000 and $233,000 per launcher kit, a figure that likely includes missiles, optical sights, training, spare parts, and transport containers, a purchase of 300 to 400 systems, organized into 4 launcher detachments, could theoretically stand up somewhere between 75 and 100 separate firing positions, scattered across the country. Analysts examining the reported deal have suggested the operational purpose is straightforward: make low-altitude penetration considerably more expensive and dangerous for American aircraft by placing launchers at exactly the kind of choke points, terrain features, and predictable flight corridors that compress an attacking pilot's options for maneuvering around a threat, particularly around strategic infrastructure, missile bases, and the nuclear facilities that have been the primary target set of this entire air campaign. It's a fundamentally different defensive philosophy than the one Iran started this war with, trading a small number of expensive, powerful, but ultimately findable radar systems for a large number of cheap, mobile, much harder to locate ones. Layer the reported reconnaissance satellite and the possible X-band radar transfer on top of that MANPADS network, and the picture becomes considerably more significant than any single piece on its own. A high-resolution reconnaissance satellite, if the Financial Times' reporting on Iran's 2024 acquisition is accurate, gives Iranian military planners an independent source of overhead imagery, useful for monitoring American naval movements, tracking force positioning in the Gulf, and identifying targets, without having to rely entirely on Iran's own limited and heavily degraded domestic capabilities. Multiple outlets have also reported, separately from the MANPADS story, that China has been providing Iran with satellite imagery of American military targets around the Gulf as part of what's been described as behind-the-scenes support, rather than direct combat involvement, support that stops well short of putting Chinese personnel or hardware directly into the fight. but that materially improves Iran's targeting picture regardless. An X-band radar system considerably more sophisticated than anything involved in the MANPADS deal would give Iran high-resolution tracking capability against incoming aircraft and missiles, addressing one of the specific technical gaps that made Iran's air defenses so vulnerable to the opening strikes of this war in the first place. None of these individual pieces, on their own, would fundamentally alter the balance of this conflict. Taken together, a mobile, hard-to-target missile network, an independent overhead imagery capability, improved radar tracking, and a resupply of the chemical precursors needed to keep building new missiles, they represent something closer to a full reconstitution effort, quietly rebuilding exactly the capabilities that months of American and Israeli strikes were specifically designed to eliminate. This is where the story stops being simply about hardware and starts being about something with considerably higher stakes for the broader relationship between Washington and Beijing, because the gap between American President public assurance from Xi and what Reuters is reporting on the ground isn't a minor diplomatic footnote. It's arguably the central tension of this entire story. When a Chinese leader personally tells an American president that Chinese companies will not arm a country the United States is actively at war with, and multiple independent reports over the following months describe exactly that happening anyway, through MANPADS, through satellite support, through missile propellant precursors, through possible radar transfers, you're left with one of a small number of explanations, none of which are particularly comfortable for the broader US-China relationship. It's possible Xi's assurance was made in good faith, and Chinese state authorities have limited practical ability to fully control commercial intermediaries, like the Hong Kong-based trading company named in the Reuters report. A genuine enforcement gap, rather than a deliberate deception. It's possible the assurance was narrowly worded in a way that technically excluded exactly this kind of indirect intermediary brokered transaction, while still being marketed publicly as a broader commitment. Or it's possible the assurance was never intended to be honored in practice and existed primarily as a diplomatic tool to manage the relationship with Washington, while Beijing's actual policy continued largely unchanged underneath it. Reuters' own reporting doesn't resolve which of these is closest to the truth, and it's worth being honest that we don't currently have enough public information to say with confidence which explanation is correct. What we can say is that whichever explanation is accurate, the practical result looks the same from the American side. A stated assurance that doesn't appear to match observed reality at the exact moment American forces are operating in the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet against an adversary these transfers would directly benefit. It's also worth being clear-eyed about China's underlying motivations here, because this almost certainly isn't primarily an ideological alliance in the way a purely military partnership might be. China remains heavily dependent on energy imports, and Iran has functioned for years as a discounted, sanctions-evading oil supplier willing to sell at prices few other producers would accept, a relationship that predates this war by a long stretch, and that gives Beijing a very concrete economic incentive to keep the Iranian government functional and solvent, regardless of the broader geopolitical optics. Selling weapons systems, even indirectly through an intermediary company specifically positioned to provide a layer of deniability, fits a pattern China has used elsewhere. Support a strategically useful partner, enough to keep them viable, while maintaining just enough distance and denial to avoid a direct, unambiguous confrontation with Washington that could jeopardize the broader US-China trade and diplomatic relationship. The Hong Kong intermediary structure, named in Reuters reporting, is a particularly telling detail in this respect. Precisely the kind of arrangement that allows a transaction to proceed while giving Beijing's foreign ministry a technically defensible basis for calling the reports baseless, since the deal, as described, doesn't necessarily require the Chinese state itself to be a direct, named party to the contract. There's a human dimension threading through all of this that's easy to lose entirely underneath the geopolitics, and it's worth sitting with directly. Every American and Israeli pilot who has flown a strike mission into Iranian airspace over the past several months has been operating against a known mapped threat picture, static radar sites, known missile battery locations, a defensive network that, however dangerous, was at least largely understood. A dispersed network of 75 to 100 mobile infrared guided firing positions, invisible to radar detection and capable of appearing almost anywhere along a predictable flight path. Changes that calculus in a way that isn't abstract for the aircrews who would actually be flying through it. It's a shift from a known, mapped risk to a genuinely uncertain one, an uncertainty in an environment where split-second decisions determine whether a crew makes it home carries its own particular weight that doesn't show up in any strategic assessment of the broader war. There's a parallel human cost on the diplomatic side too, considerably quieter but real in its own way. American officials who spent months building a working relationship with Chinese counterparts around managing this conflict, officials who presumably relayed Xi's personal assurance up the chain in good faith, now facing the uncomfortable position of explaining why that assurance doesn't appear to match what's actually moving through Urumqi and Pakistan toward Iranian ports. So where does this actually go from here? There are several plausible paths worth walking through individually, because the range of outcomes carries genuinely different levels of consequence. The first is that this deal, like several reported Chinese weapons transfers before it, proceeds quietly. The shipment arrives roughly as described. Iran begins standing up its mobile MANPADS network, and the practical effect is a gradual incremental increase in the risk facing American and Israeli aircraft operating over Iran without triggering any dramatic public confrontation between Washington and Beijing. Given the pattern established by the April MANPADS reporting, the satellite revelations, and the sodium perchlorate shipments, all of which generated denials and warnings but no confirmed direct American retaliation against China specifically, this arguably remains the most likely near-term outcome. The second path is that American intelligence agencies, having been tracking this specific route through Urumqi and Pakistan since before the shipment reportedly left China, find a way to disrupt or intercept it before it reaches Iran, whether through diplomatic pressure on Pakistan, direct interdiction, or leveraging the deal's exposure in the press to make completing the transaction politically costlier for all three governments involved. Reuters' own sourcing noted Iran was specifically exploring more discreet overland routes precisely because previous shipments and reports had already drawn this kind of scrutiny, suggesting all parties involved understand exactly how exposed this specific transaction already is. The third path, and the one with the broadest consequences beyond this specific conflict, is that this becomes the moment the American president administration decides China's pattern of denials no longer matches its pattern of behavior closely enough to let pass without a direct response, whether through new sanctions specifically targeting the Hong Kong intermediary and any Chinese entities connected to it, or through a broader recalibration of the presumably fragile trust underlying American president characterization of his personal relationship with Xi. Given how publicly and specifically American president had cited Xi's personal assurance only days before this report broke, a pattern that repeats itself, additional confirmed shipments, additional denials that don't hold up, would put real pressure on the administration to demonstrate the relationship's credibility one way or another, either through visible consequences for Beijing or through a public acknowledgement that the assurance simply isn't being honored. The fourth and broadest path is that this entire episode becomes one data point in a much larger, slower recalibration of how Washington approaches its relationship with Beijing generally, feeding into separate ongoing concerns about Chinese behavior toward Taiwan, and reinforcing a view already circulating in Washington that China's public diplomatic assurances and its actual strategic behavior are becoming two increasingly separate things that shouldn't be assumed to move together. If that broader recalibration takes hold, this specific MANPADS shipment, whatever its ultimate size or timing turns out to be, will likely be remembered less for the weapons themselves and more as one of the moments that accelerated a much bigger shift in how the United States calibrates trust with China across every theater, not just this one. What ties this entire story together is a fairly stark question sitting underneath all the reported shipments, denials, and diplomatic assurances. Can a great power simultaneously position itself publicly as a peace-seeking mediator in a war, while its own companies, operating through carefully structured intermediaries, are reportedly rebuilding the losing side's ability to keep fighting it? China's public position throughout this conflict has been one of restraint and diplomacy, condemning the strikes rhetorically while avoiding any direct military involvement of its own forces. The reporting on MANPADS, satellite imagery, reconnaissance capability, and missile fuel precursors suggests a considerably more active, if carefully deniable, role underneath the public posture, one specifically structured to avoid ever requiring Beijing to publicly own it. Whether that gap between stated position and reported behavior eventually becomes the moment that reshapes how Washington deals with Beijing, or simply another entry in a long list of denied reports that fade from the news cycle within weeks, depends heavily on what happens to this specific shipment over the next several weeks, and whether it's the last one of its kind or simply the most recent in a pattern that shows no real sign of stopping. Keep an eye on whether American officials name specific entities for sanctions in the weeks following this report, because that, more than any diplomatic statement, would be the clearest signal of how seriously Washington is treating the gap between what Xi reportedly promised and what Reuters' sources are describing on the ground. And watch closely for any confirmed sighting of QW-12 or FN-16 systems actually being deployed inside Iran, since that would move the story from the realm of well-sourced reporting into unambiguous, visually confirmed fact, the kind of evidence that would be very difficult for Beijing to keep denying. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When a personal assurance between two world leaders doesn't appear to match what's reportedly moving through cargo routes and intermediary companies on the ground, is that a failure of enforcement, a failure of honesty, or simply how great power diplomacy has always actually worked beneath its public surface? Drop your read on that in the comments. And if you want to know the moment this shipment is confirmed, one way or another, subscribe, because that's the story that could change how this entire war is fought.